this topic through my PhD research at a school in Berlin, in which I looked at how social vulnerabilities such as poverty, educational deprivation, behavior, and mental health problems were reproduced or resisted intergenerationally. So what I really did here was I really took the sort of a grounded theory approach and looked at what was impacting youth. And what Duldung, the temporary protection, was really one of the findings. It was once I started doing family interviews, it became a really big point that this temporary protection was one of the main factors that was impacting youth as they grow up. And what I, second of all, did was I looked at how children social navigate these processes and how does that influence resistance or reiteration of these processes. And by social navigation, I'm really looking at child agency. So I'm looking at what they do, how they react, and how they also influence their environment. So being tolerated in German is called Duldung, and that's really translated as toleration, and it's often called Kettenduldung. And Ketten means chain, which means that you have, what they're referring to is a constant, another link to the chain added, because it's short-term protection of 3 to 6 months each time, and over long periods of time. So the families I worked with were between 7 and 21 years on this temporary protection status. And were constantly subjected to changes in laws and financial regulations and had no chance for integration because they were deemed to be deported or to leave at any point that it was safe to return. They couldn't do a driver's license, couldn't leave Berlin, no education, no work, and no language integration courses. So these families are really in a form of legal limbo, in a form of stagnancy until they were off this status. And imagine this for many, many years. And having to renew it every 3 to 6 months, especially for different family members, they're constantly going back to immigration services and having to renew the status. So especially if the mother and the father and then the children have different statuses, it's a constant process, especially when there are deferrals happening in the family. So the effects of it, there was some research done amongst Bosnian refugees on this status. And I really liked how Heiken described as flight without arrival, and this new war in Berlin was how it was described. And what we can see here is that it can be argued that these new experiences of Duldung are just as traumatizing as some of the earlier conflicts, while there are different contexts. A lot of the parents that arrived were extremely thankful to Germany because Duldung seemed better than the refugee camps they experienced previously. However, it was still a very stressful experience. Now, what I'm looking at here in this paper specifically, I'm taking a generational approach. So what are the intergenerational effects of long-term temporary protection in families? So what are parents, how are parents reacting, and how do children then react to it? And this is where the social navigation part comes in, and how does it lead to resisting or reiterating social vulnerabilities? And how does it impact youth's future perspectives? So the way I investigated this was through ethnographic research. I'm a medical anthropologist. So I really, for 19 months, spent lots of time in this neighborhood with lots of families. It's a school of ethnography. So I was in a school and I worked with many of the mothers specifically. So I have very much a female perspective on many of these things. But I also worked with many students, anywhere from grade 5 to 13, with a focus grade 5 to 8. I worked with social workers, key players in the neighborhood, and interviewed pretty much anybody who would sit down with me, and spent a lot of time just also watching and participating, and did a few projects also inside and outside the school. So where was this exactly? This is a big question, and this is in North Neukölln. It's in Berlin. And Neukölln is a neighborhood that has long deemed in Germany kind of gotten a reputation for being sort of a failure of integration, an example of failure of integration in Germany. And it's sort of described as a multicultural ghetto, and Germany actually had a fear of a creation of parallel societies, where they thought that immigrant communities were kind of creating a coherent front against German society without wanting to integrate. But if you look very closely, they're incredibly multicultural, and there's little cohesion in the communities themselves. So this was actually an unfounded fear. And there's a high rate of repeating trends through the generations. So it's a very poverty-stricken neighborhood, which is currently being rapidly gentrified or hipsterfied, as some people say. And the school I worked at was over 90% of children from families with a history of migration and over 85% of youth from welfare or refugee families. So we have, and most of these youth were Muslim. Many of them Palestinians from Lebanon. So in 1975 to 1990, the Lebanese Civil War happened, and many people in Lebanon, whether they were Lebanese nationals, Palestinian, Kurdish, escaped to Germany and got in through the East Berlin Gap. So when the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, there was a short window when many people could enter into Germany. And many of them ended up in Neukölln on this Duldung status. So we're talking about a huge community of people of various ethnic backgrounds on the same status, in the same form of stagnancy. So we're talking, in the terms of Palestinians, 30 to 50,000. So this is a huge population in the same limbo status. And many came without any education, in a state of poverty, and also many traumatized from their experiences of war and third-generation refugee existence of the Palestinians also. And there's quite a lot of crime families, intergenerational transmission of crime in this community as well. And there's still very strong ties between Lebanon and Neukölln. And there's sort of one main shopping street there, and it's kind of been nicknamed the Gaza Strip or Lebanon Street, sort of in reference to this large population. Now, if we're looking at the intergenerational lens and talking about Palestinians, many will automatically think historical trauma, and it's definitely apparent, especially and when they're coming through Lebanon. There's a lot of previous occurrences that have shaped their experiences in Germany. And being Palestinian is an incredibly important identity marker. What I'm emphasizing here is sort of their experiences of the immediate environment. So I'm not neglecting what's happened in the past. I want to also acknowledge what's happening in the current situation and how parents' current behaviors are influencing their children. And because I'm a medical anthropologist, this is a qualitative research, I used Dixon Gomez here to kind of help to look at what intergenerational processes are being transmitted. And she differentiates between implicit and explicit processes to sort of help to give it a qualitative lens. And these differentiate between sort of internal symptoms and external gossip, lies, accusations. Now, I used one specific family to show what's happening. I used the family El Tahan. I changed all their names, so this is a new name for this family. It was one of my main research families, and I thought that by using one family, I would actually show what was happening the best instead of going and changing contexts all the time. And this is the mother, and this is her experience of being on Duldung. And I spent many hours with them sitting in their living room, drinking very strong coffee. You live on the edge of your nerves when you're on Duldung. They treat you like animals, no rights, no nothing. So this was an aspect of experience of what it was like. And she said, I was always afraid. And she really emphasized that she was constantly about to break down completely because of the rejections. So the family did receive rejections quite a few times. And I even have stories of another family where a mother kept getting deferrals if she wasn't pregnant. So they would constantly show up at the door, try to take her home. So she realized her way of staying in the country was to be pregnant all the time. So this happened in some families. There's quite a lot of stories that circulate around here, and as soon as you start bringing up the topic, everybody has quite profound stories around this status. The family, this is a timeline. I think you can read it from up there. At the top, the lines, these are births and family members, the children being born. At the bottom is sort of what happened. So Fatima, the mother, grew up in the refugee refugee camps in Lebanon. Caleb didn't. That's her husband. And they married when she was 18 and he was 21. And they had 2 children right away, Imani and Samir. And Fatima had 3 brothers that already left to Germany before her, and she wanted to join right away. And then took the last opportunity in 1990 before the East Berlin Gap closed to go to Germany and end up in the asylum centers in Germany. And Caleb arrived 2 years later via illegal routes. So that was quite a bit of drama reuniting the family. And then they finally left the asylum centers and found an apartment in Neukölln without heating. The children were always sick. It gets quite cold in the winter in Berlin. And they constantly had to figure out the new system. So while Fatima finished high school, Caleb was almost illiterate. She actually wanted, they were quite young when they arrived. They wanted to work and integrate, but they were sitting in a position where they spent most of their time figuring out the asylum, like the changing procedures. So they would receive letters from the state, go to the lawyer, go to immigration services. So that became sort of their routine. And in 2003, the law changed, and they were actually allowed to work if they could not take a single penny from the state. So now you have a family with 4 children, and nearly a mother who is literate, who could actually learn German, and a father who's illiterate, trying to earn their own money, 100%. And this was actually the worst time for the family, as they had more children. The fridge was always empty at home. They couldn't pay for heating. And so the children put themselves to school, and Samir, the boy, was like, okay, well, let's figure out our own situation. And he went into crime and drugs and made his own quick money because he could never go to his parents for problems. And Imani ended up dropping out of school to take care of our younger siblings. So you have some process where children are trying to figure out their own ways in a situation where the parents are really strained. And when they finally gained residency in 2007, the family was pretty broken at that point, and they actually very quickly sold the diner because the parents were sick. They had back problems. Fatima had neck problems. They couldn't carry things anymore. And the little children were also not, like, the Imani kept saying that the doctor thought the children were hers because she was there so often. So the children were always sick as well. And so the family went on welfare. Imani married very quickly and found a job. And then Samira took over the parenting, and she still is. So she finished high school, but she is actually the one who is now taking care of the children to this day. And her parents are still very much sick. And I will address some of the further points as we talk a bit more about the youth themselves. So I will quickly just jump to the highlighted parts. I could never go to my parents when I had problems. They had enough problems. So this was a really big thing that was often emphasized. We solved everything amongst us. So he joined bands of boys with a similar future perspective, and also said, we can't depend on others. So they thought everything was their own responsibility, and especially not the police. So if we look at Imani, the girl, she also had this thing, no, you don't talk about your problems, you keep everything within. And aspect of shame, the shame of being on this status. She thought that nobody else was, and actually most of the people around them were also on this status, so even the youth didn't talk about it amongst themselves. This is also something I found in the school. And why should I add to their problems and this aspect of not having a very good future perspective? So if we look at Laila, she's age 20, she's the one who finished high school. She really emphasized that they learned responsibility early on. I'm like a mother to the little ones. So when I sat in their living room, the kids always ran to her directly. They never went to their mom. She was really the one who the kids relied on. And for her, she really felt safe there, but she felt extremely misunderstood. And this aspect of me being misunderstood was also something that often came up. Now, Hanif is not part of the family. He's from a Lebanese family, but this quote really showed another aspect that I thought should be emphasized. Again, this zero hope for the future and this aspect of being stuck. See, he's now 28, and he came off of Duldung when he was 27. And he said, well, I didn't finish my schooling because why would I? I go right into welfare, I go right onto this status, so why care about my schooling? So there was this, and now that they're done with school, they're feeling stuck, despite being on permanent residency all of a sudden. So now they feel like they've wasted a lot of time and still can't move forward with their lives. So what's happening? If we're looking at the inability of parents to parents, these are diverse outcomes for their children depending on age and gender. And there's an aspect of family isolation. So there is little family cohesiveness going on. And the aspect of youth not wanting to depend on their parents or anybody externally because there's a lack of trust, also a fear of social services intervening. And then we also have this aspect of parentification, which ultimately can have good and bad effects on the youth. However, in this case, many children sacrifice their own schooling for their younger siblings. Yeah? And then there's also this aspect of youth being very afraid for their parents' health and safety. What we then have is this religion aspect taking a strong hold in the community, and this has been in the last, I started my research in 2013, 2015, that it was already on the rise, and by the time I left in 2015, it was quite strong. A lot of youth were praying in the school, there was Qurans being handed out, and the school is mostly children from refugee status. And it was a big part of how they navigated some of what was going on. And what parents and youth are looking for approval and cohesion, and they really find in religion, and most of the families I worked with went to a very conservative Salafist church that was also considered one of the most radical in Berlin. If we're looking at the community, there's many youth in the same position: anger, frustration, and also expressions of violence. And there's many youth who counter the parents' victim status, which was very interesting, as they kind of said, like, kein Opfer. It's like, don't be a victim. And they use this as a swear word, and also you refugee was also sort of a swear word. So they also said this to each other. And there's also a little cohesion in the community itself, and quite a bit of jealousy and gossip and social control amongst each other, and especially with the rise of religion, there was a lot of social control happening. And also a lot of shared community experiences, for example, the stories of older youth coming down. And so what we have in the community, there's a lot of hope, yet there's also a lot of disillusionment, especially in German institutions. And higher education. And as I mentioned already, there's many youth are facing regrets and having missed out on their education when they didn't have any future perspectives, and now they're kind of going retrospective and going, okay, maybe it would have been good to do some schooling. And then, yeah, there's a lot of hope, especially in the younger children who are not growing up in the structures. So, in conclusion, I just want to point out 3 quick points, is that permanent residency for these families was a necessary step, but it hasn't been a solution. And there have been sort of effects that have intergenerational effects. And the benefit of ethnography in this situation has really brought forward some of the minor factors that shape youth identities and forms, like what prevents them from truly belonging. However, I think 19 months was a good window. I think going back is definitely going to show what's happening with these youth. And the rise of religion isn't just in this population, it's in the community as a whole. And it goes beyond that. And there's definitely an aspect of shaping reactive ethnicities. And what the rise in religion has brought, especially in the school, is it has decreased crime, or at least public declarations of crime. So that's actually a really interesting sort of end finding to that. Thank you.